If you've been woodworking for more than a few minutes, you've probably heard people repeating certain rules. Never rest a hand plane blade down on the bench. Always measure twice, cut once. Never climb cut with a router. Never use a miter gauge with the fence. Always alternate growth rings in panel glue-ups. Always rip wide boards down into narrow strips for stability. Always use the golden ratio. Well, I'm here to tell you that I break these rules all the time, on purpose, because I'm a rebel.
I'm a loner, Daddy. A rebel.
You know, truthfully, it's not about being rebellious at all. It's really just about experience. Most woodworking rules originally came from a place of truth, but woodworking has so many variables between different tools, different materials, different techniques, that very rarely is a situation classified in terms of always or never. It's hard to ever apply those terms. And there's almost never just one way to get the job done. But I think it's important to understand why these rules exist. Once you understand them, you can decide for yourself if they're worth following or ignoring. So here are 7 woodworking rules and why I break them constantly. Never rest a hand plane blade down on the bench. This one's a classic. I used to get yelled at all the time in the old woodworking forums for setting my plane blade down on the workbench. The theory being that since the blade is exposed on the bottom, setting the plane down on the bench could damage or prematurely dull the blade. The suggestion was usually to lay the plane on its side or retract the blade before setting it down. But this never really made sense to me. Your workbench is made of wood. You know, it's the same stuff that you use that plane to cut through like butter. So unless your bench is super dirty, has random bits of metal laying on it, or is made of concrete, there's really no harm in setting a plane down onto the bench. Now, of course, when the plane is down, you could certainly gouge the work surface, but I wouldn't worry about the blade getting damaged. In my opinion, resting a plane on the bench on its side is even worse. With the blade exposed, you can easily hit it with another tool, or worse yet, your hands. Now look, there's nothing wrong with taking precautions, so if you're worried about it, lay the plane down on a little piece of scrap so that the blade isn't even touching the surface. And in my case, with the split top Rubo, my center stop sits just a hair below the surface, so I can actually rest my plane with the blade right there if I want. But if you're going around yelling at people in forums for setting their plane blade down on the workbench, you might be doing life wrong. Man, I'm getting hungry. Good thing today's show is sponsored by HelloFresh. Nicole and I run our own business, so by the time dinner rolls around, our brains are usually done making decisions. That's why we've relied on HelloFresh over the years for fresh, home-cooked meals without all the planning and shopping. Everything arrives organized, measured out, and ready to put away until we need it. Tonight we're making the figgy balsamic pork. I chop and roast the vegetables, cook the pork, and finish it with this fig and balsamic glaze that is really the star of the show. The ingredients are fresh, the recipes are easy to follow, and the food tastes like something we'd actually choose to make ourselves. HelloFresh also has a new quick and easy menu for nights when cooking needs to require as little brain power as possible. Click my link below to get a free Caraway food storage set, $155 value with your 3rd box of HelloFresh. That's with the 3rd box of an active subscription while supplies last for a limited time only. Thanks HelloFresh for sponsoring, and now back to the show. Measure twice, cut once. This isn't bad advice by any means. After all, lots of things can go wrong when taking measurements. You might read the measurement wrong, you could transpose numbers, or you could do something that I'm very good at doing, and that's forgetting the number by the time you're at the tool ready to make the cut. But even when you measure twice, there's always potential to mess things up. As we get older, it can be harder to read those small lines. Then once you have the measurement, you need to set up the tool to match that number. And don't forget that when making the cut, you need to decide on which side of the line you are cutting, and maybe you're just trying to split the line. There's a lot of potential for error. So rather than measure twice, I try not to measure at all. Instead, I use relative dimensioning and story sticks. An example of relative dimensioning would be cutting a mortise and tenon joint. When I cut the tenon, I leave it intentionally oversized. I make the cuts, then test the fit, and I slowly sneak up on the perfect fit. Once I have it, the setting is locked in and I can make the rest of the tenons. At no point do I measure the tenon thickness. I don't really care. It either fits or it doesn't. And this cut to fit logic can be applied across nearly all elements of furniture making. I actually wrote an article about this in Popular Woodworking and did a video on it back in 2009. Yeah, I'm that old. I'll link to those in the description if you want to watch. Now, what about a story stick? A good example is laying out mortise locations. I'll often make marks on a piece of scrap, and using a common reference point, I can make sure that I get exact mortise locations on each workpiece. And when you have to make multiples, a story stick dramatically reduces the chances of a misplaced mortise. And this is another technique that you can use on every project to help minimize the chances of making measurement errors. So if you need to measure, by all means, measure twice. It never hurts to double check yourself, but always try to think of other ways that we can get the same end result, but with a more foolproof process. Never climb cut with a router. Routers spin bits clockwise. That means that if you run the tool in the wrong direction, you'll be going with that rotation and the tool can get out of control. So you generally want to run the router from left to right when the router is between you and the workpiece. That's going to give you the most control, but sometimes you can go the wrong way intentionally, and that's called climb cutting. Most people will tell you never do it. But there are situations where it can be helpful when done correctly. For instance, we're all familiar with tear out, right? When you get tear out with a router, the first thing you want to try is taking smaller bites. Work your way down just a little bit at a time. But if that first light pass creates tear out, you're kinda screwed. So sometimes I'll run the bit backwards, taking no more than a 1/16 of an inch pass just to create a scoring line. With that clean starting edge, we can then work our way down to full depth. Another option is to use the climb cut as the final cleanup pass. Work your way down, and then reserve that last 1/16 of an inch to a 32nd just to make that one pass with the climb cut. And that can often produce more favorable results. Something else that tends to come up when you're rounding end grain is what happens once there's no more material at the end of the cut. You'll almost always have some kind of tear out. So I'll often very carefully work my way back in, doing a climb cut just to clean up that last little bit with less risk of tear out. Another situation where you might see me climb cut is when using a very small profile bit like my 1/8 inch roundover bit. Almost all of my projects get hit with the trim router and this 1/8 inch bit. It takes so little material away that the direction you go really doesn't make much difference. So as long as you have a good grip on the router, you're good to go. So I often climb cut just for convenience or easier body positioning. Just keep in mind that the router wants to go fast, so you might be tempted to let it. If you do that, you could end up with a lower quality edge because you're essentially getting fewer cuts per inch as you rush across the surface. So control the router, go at a steady pace, and you're going to be fine. Now, by no means am I encouraging you to seek out climb cuts, but you should understand what a climb cut is, how it works, what makes it dangerous, and why you can sometimes ignore the no climb cutting rule. Never use a miter gauge with the fence. Generally speaking, this is a solid rule. If you use your miter gauge with your fence as the stop, the offcut can get trapped between the fence and the blade and cause an incredibly dangerous kickback. So dangerous, in fact, I'm not even going to try to demo it. But here's a dramatic reenactment. Oh no! Now obviously, no one wants this to happen, so before I tell you when I break this rule, I should show you how you're supposed to make this kind of cut. If you attach a piece of scrap to your fence before the blade, you could then use that as a stop. Then when you make the cut, the offcut drops into an open space safely. But here's the thing, not every cut results in an offcut. For instance, when I'm cutting joinery on the end of a board, like a tenon or a rabbet, I'm only making sawdust. There's nothing to get trapped between the blade and the fence. And you can make this cut all day long and you've got zero risk of kickback. Well, there's no such thing as zero risk, but let's say as long as you don't decide to scratch your butt in the middle of the cut, there's essentially zero chance of kickback. I like to scratch my butt even when I'm not making a cut. Always alternate the growth rings in panel glue-ups. As you've probably discovered already in your woodworking, wood moves, and it generally moves in predictable ways. For instance, if a board is going to cup, it usually cups in the opposite direction of the growth rings, or what would be away from the center of the tree. So a long time ago, woodworkers decided that when making a big panel like a tabletop, that it was best to alternate the growth rings of each board. One up, one down, one up, one down. The logic being that if the boards were to cup, they won't go all in one direction and the top will stay flatter overall. You can see in this diagram that the top panel has the end grain rings all going the same way, so they work in concert to create a major cup. The bottom panel has alternating rings, so each board kind of cancels out the cupping of the previous and you end up with a wavy board. So my first point that I'll make pertains to these two tops. Honestly, which one would you rather have to deal with? They both suck, but at least with the top one, your table base or maybe some added battens or C-channel might help you correct the cup. For the wavy one, I really don't know how you're going to fix that. The surface would just be a nightmare to live with, and no amount of screws or bracing is likely to correct it. And my second point comes from the time when this rule was first developed. And things were a little bit different back then. Milling procedures weren't exactly standardized, wood drying was kind of hit or miss, and perhaps most importantly, The furniture that they made wasn't being used in stable interior environments. Today, most of our material is kiln dried, which imparts a whole lot of stability, and nearly all of our interior furniture is kept in homes where humidity and temperature are fairly constant, so the chances of cupping are vastly reduced. With more stable material and connecting it to a nice robust base, you have to ask yourself if alternating the end grain makes any sense at all. I personally don't think it does, so that's why I orient my boards visually. I look for the best faces and point them in the direction that they're going to be seen the most. What happens on the ends is mostly irrelevant unless I'm actually trying to create some kind of visible grain pattern. And keep in mind, with some species, the end grain is highly visible, so creating a pattern there might be worth considering. The point is, I don't think that you need to make these decisions based on a cupping event that may never occur. In my 20 plus years of ignoring this particular rule, I've never had an instance where I wish I would have alternated the grain. I'm not saying that I've never had a panel cup or a table warp, I'm just saying that alternating the grain really wouldn't have improved the situation. Always rip wide boards down into narrower strips for stability. In a similar vein as the previous rule, woodworkers often think that they need to break down wide boards into narrow strips to help lessen the effects of cupping. So think about the extreme cupping situation again. Narrow boards just can't cup as much as wide boards. So it seems logical to say that a narrow board glue-up would be more stable than one that's made with wider boards. But again, modern drying methods and interior conditions mean that wood is a lot more stable than we give it credit for. So if I'm lucky enough to have nice wide boards and the ability to flatten them, you know that I'm going to be using them in a tabletop. It'll look better, it's fewer boards to glue up, and that means fewer glue lines. Now, of course, some people might just prefer the butcher block or gymnasium floor look, but for me, I'd rather have nice continuous grain and minimal glue lines. So back in 2010, I made a trestle table, and I was lucky enough to have two giant mahogany boards that I was going to use for the top. I heard from countless people at the time that I should cut those boards down, otherwise the top was just doomed to cup and warp. Well, 16 years and 3 states later, the top is still not cupped. Now, we originally used this table for gaming, and now it serves as a table in our shop kitchen. Fingers crossed that it continues to stay flat, but I can't see any reason why it won't. Always use the golden ratio. If you haven't heard of the golden ratio, it's something designers often refer to that dictates the proportions of a rectangle. In woodworking, we might use it to come up with dimensions for a door, maybe a tabletop. The ratio is 1 to 1.618, and the idea is that it's a natural proportion that humans generally find pleasing. So you'll often hear woodworkers saying that if you're not using the golden ratio to guide your designs, you're doing something wrong. But the truth is, I don't really use the golden ratio for anything anymore. If I use ratios, they're going to be as close as I can get to whole numbers like 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 4. While there's certainly nothing wrong with using the golden ratio as a starting point, especially if you don't have any other pressing reason that's kind of forcing you into a set of dimensions, I can't imagine letting it be some kind of hard and fast rule. Personally, I don't think a 1 to 1.618 rectangle is any more pleasing than ones with ratios I can actually remember and calculate in my head. In my opinion, it is far more important to size things based on the space that they're going to occupy and your personal tastes, rather than any supposed theoretical ideal. And if you can, try to incorporate ratios into your designs, and that'll go a long way into making sure that your proportions make some kind of visual sense. In this example, we have a 3/4 inch top, that's pretty standard, 1.5 inch square legs, and a 3 inch apron. So the whole thing is applying a 2-to-1 ratio with 3/4 as the base element. And again, this is just a starting point. Especially if you're new to woodworking, you might not know where to begin when designing things. So using standard ratios can really be incredibly helpful, and you can modify things to your liking from there. So to be clear, the goal is never to simply ignore the rules. Rules are very important. They guide us in the right direction, especially when we're first starting out. And keeping these rules simple by using words like never and always prevents the conversation from getting too convoluted too early by having to consider all those exceptions. So I'm not saying that any of this stuff is bad or wrong, but once you get past the beginner stage, it's time to realize that these rules aren't so black and white. And once you understand the reason and logic behind the rule, you can easily identify when it's safe to break it. Stay skeptical, stay safe. I'll see you next time. If you hadn't If you haven't really having trouble with words. Well, look at me, I'm so graceful. I'm like a breakdancer in the 80s. Okay, ready? I'm gonna go, oh no! And then you're gonna give it a, not so hard, like a toss to the head.
Okay.
This is a real.
Are you sure?
No, I'm no longer sure. Oh no! Just make sure my eyes are protected. Ready? Oh no! Oh no! Thanks, Nicole. It looks nice. Look like some kind of weird superhero.